that we can talk about has to deal primarily with the South, and it's a spread out of those African Americans from some colonies into some of the other colonies. It's primarily a southern migration.
Yes, going towards the South, not away from the South, really from the East Coast to the South. However, of course, slavery ended and we got into the period of Reconstruction, which during that time you still had about 91% of people of African descent living in the South. However, of course, we know that Reconstruction ended. And at the end of the Reconstruction period and getting into the early 1880s, there were about 5 million blacks in the United States, and again, 90% of those lived in what's defined as the South. However, at the end of Reconstruction, lots of bad things started to happen to black people in the South. And so that began the period of what's called the Exodusters migration. This is a migration that's not really talked about, and that is when blacks left en masse from parts of the South and went to the West, to Kansas, to Texas, to Oklahoma, and they established all black towns and all black cities, and even they founded parts of what is now Houston, Texas, which began as an Exodusters migration, ex-slaves moving west. In fact, Nashville plays a big role. What was believed to be the largest Exodusters migration started right here in Nashville, as approximately 60,000 disgruntled blacks left here en masse and went west. And if you think about it, 60,000 blacks in Nashville over 100 years ago, in terms of what percentage of the population that might have been, we might have 250,000 blacks in the whole metropolitan area here today. So just think about a quarter, that would be a quarter of the black population today. So I imagine at that time that was almost nearly all of the African Americans in Middle Tennessee up and left en masse all at once. So that's significant.
You know, Dr. Padgett, you mentioned these small black towns that were a result of migration from the South to the West. Let's say some other things about these small black towns, because I think that you see them in almost every state here and there. And if you would like to, why don't you name a couple of them so that we can more closely identify them, and how were they constituted, and how did they come into being? Some of them, you know, in terms of just a general statement in reference to them.
Well, some of them probably don't exist today, but you had Nicodemus, Kansas. There's a town called Winona in Texas, which is still a small town outside of Tyler, Texas, but that was founded by freed Africans. Also, some of the wards in downtown Houston, once again, were founded by people of African descent who were moving towards the West. So those are just 3 examples of these towns. There are a lot of towns called free towns in parts of Oklahoma and other places in the West that are just remnants of this Exodus movement.
And so generally, many of us generally see the Exodus or the movement of African Americans primarily from from the South to the North. But what you're saying is that even before the Northern migration, that there's a considerable migration of African Americans that will go out west rather than to go south. What are some of the things, what are some of the motivations for them moving from the South into the West from that perspective?
Well, the end of Reconstruction, where you had blacks being lynched, killed, forced off their land. The Associated Press has just released a story that I've been reading about how blacks lost hundreds of thousands of acres of land that was just stolen from them, and in some cases the state governments took the land. It wasn't just the Klan. So under those conditions, people had lots of good reasons to leave, even though they were leaving to what could be termed unexplored, untested territory. Anything was better than the situations under which they were living in the South at that time.
And so this exodus that went from the South heading first to the West was one that was primarily driven by really, in a real sense, fear of remaining where they were. I would imagine better opportunities might have also played some role, but more than anything, you think that fear was the motivating factor that forced many of them out of the South after Reconstruction.
Yeah, well, that and the westward expansion was occurring during that time. And what's interesting is that a lot of blacks were chastised for leaving. People said, "Well, stay here in the South, don't go west." And so they were chastised for leaving. Many of them.
Okay, and of course, Dr. Padgett, let us take this first commercial break, after which we'll come back and resume this conversation. We'll be back with you following this short commercial break. Thank you, and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. The topic is patterns of African-American migration in the United States, and we're talking to Dr. David Padgett, who is a geographer at Tennessee State University. And of course, Dr. Padgett, before we had our first commercial break, we were talking about some of the patterns of African-American migration, and you indicated that primarily it was a movement from the South toward the West. But now what I'd like to talk about during this segment is what is generally considered to be the Great African-American Migration, that migration that occurred between the census reports of 1910, 1920, and et cetera. Let's talk about it from that perspective. Let's have you give us some information about this Great Migration.
Okay, yes, indeed. Yes, certainly the Great Migration, of course, is the one that we're most familiar with historically, where mass numbers of blacks left the South in the early part of the 20th century. Now, there were some push factors that differed somewhat from those that pushed the exodusters out. There were a lot of natural disasters that occurred in the early part of the century. There were floods. Black people lived primarily in low-lying areas. There was the boll weevil plague that wiped out cotton crops and put a lot of black people out of work. And so that, along with the racism and the rise of the Klan and land theft and lynchings, that was still there. That hadn't gone away. Those were push factors for pushing blacks out of the South. And what was interesting was that still at that time, in the early part of the 20th century, 90% of blacks lived in the South, and 80% of that population lived in rural areas. So you had primarily a rural to urban migratory pattern where you had people from rural areas going north, in this case of the Great Migration, to Chicago, to Detroit, to Cleveland. In fact, the black populations of some of those cities, such as Chicago and Detroit, actually increased 200–300% during that short period of time. And so the pull factors, what pulled black people to those cities, of course, were jobs, opportunities, more freedom, probably educational opportunities, all these things that they were not getting in the South. And so this was a significant movement, mass movement of black people.
Now, what impact did this have on the northern parts of the United States? I think you indicated that all of these African Americans, 90% are in the South, either Southwest and et cetera, but all of a sudden, within a 10-year period, they started appearing in Detroit and in Chicago, 200% increase and et cetera. How did the people in many of these areas, black and white, feel in reference to all these African Americans coming to these cities?
Well, in some cases, there was, of course, resistance by the white community. There was some vagrancy laws passed. Obviously, a lot of blacks did not get a job upon arrival in some of these cities, so they would end up out of work for periods of time. So you had these vagrancy laws where blacks would be jailed for being unemployed or vagrants. And so that was one reaction. What's interesting, as I saw in the Smithsonian Institution exhibit on the Great Migration, is that there was also resistance amongst northern blacks who saw themselves as being more refined and being or higher class than these Negroes from the South. And there were some types of behaviors or things that blacks in the South commonly did that were frowned upon by northern blacks, such as sitting out on the porch braiding a girl's hair. That was seen as being uncouth or talking loud. And so a lot of the parts of that exhibit in the Smithsonian Institution had old documents that northern blacks would hand the southern blacks about etiquette, how to act in public. And it was really interesting. I never thought that would happen, but there was white resistance and somewhat of black resistance to these newcomers from the South.
And you know, we've often heard it said, Dr. Padgett, that many African Americans who were already in the northern parts of the United States who represented a very, very small percentage of the population, really felt that they did not have a problem relating to the white population, but once these blacks from the southern parts of the United States, the many and the uncouth and et cetera, not only did it create a problem for the southern African Americans, but it also created a problem for the northern African Americans too. And so therefore they sort of resisted and resented some of these newly arrived. And I think, as you can probably testify, that the same thing probably happened to the new immigrants. When we talk about the 1890s, when all of these immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe, and would you say that perhaps the African American situation from North to South might have been comparable to the Southern Eastern European situation coming to the United States? Would you see any kind of comparison in that as a geographer?
Yeah, perhaps to some degree, but in many cases, on the family level, I don't think there was resistance, because it was actually family members who were calling down south saying, look, come on up here, you know, there's opportunities, you know, so, and I'm pretty sure the same thing was happening with Europeans. If there were Europeans who would come here who said, called their cousins or whomever back home and said, come on over. But I think you probably had a small portion of the established black elite who offered resistance, but it wasn't resistance to the point that they were causing harm. That was unlike the vagrancy laws and other laws that were passed to crack down on the exploding black populations.
Too many, in other words, there were too many African Americans as far as the lawmakers were concerned, and of course, as far as their own members of their race was concerned, that they not only were there too many of them, they were bringing too many bad habits from the southern parts of the United States that was not necessarily approved by African Americans in the North. And of course, Dr. Padgett, I think that in a real sense, you came to us earlier and talked about these kinds of trends that occurred. Now, after the Great Migration, what's the status of the African American population in terms of its movement after that? Do they stabilize or whatever during this period?
Well, the Great Migration moved forward until, of course, the Depression. And the Depression obviously slowed things down quite a bit. However, the Second World War brought forth a second movement as the boom times after the war resulted in an expansion of the secondary or manufacturing economy. Right after the Second World War, 99% of all the cars made in the world were made in Michigan, that one state. So there were lots of opportunities in the steel mills for African Americans with little formal education to come up and work with their hands and make a good living.
And so it was the industry that helped propel and helped to sustain, in a real sense, members of this great migration, that after they got there, there was something for them to do after they became adjusted and whatever. Very good. And of course, Dr. Padgett, we're getting ready for this second commercial break, after which we'll come back and we'll give you an opportunity to talk about some of the recent trends dealing with this African-American population. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break.